It's a brand new meta out there. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. For the first time in a long time, the first deck on the list is not going to be something like OldRishem or something that beats OldRishem. It is going to actually be Sandman. The Patriot Sandman deck is the most played iteration of the multiple Sandman lists, and I think that there is a lot of good reason for that. Typically, Sandman sort of face plants when it's faced by OldRishem, but being able to play Cassandra Nova into Absorbing Man does give this Sandman deck a much more reasonable game plan into that kind of stuff. One of the major iterations that has been made on multiple Sandman lists is the inclusion of Ultron. And I know many people will look at this and sort of wonder why we're playing Ultron in a deck with Iron Lad, and I get that, but the fundamental answer is that Ultron is just going to be better than Doctor Doom a decent amount of the time. One note I will have here is that Doctor Doom and Ultron are cards you're going to want to swap out occasionally, especially if you're playing at the highest levels of the game. Going back and forth on what your 6-drops are can make it much more difficult for your opponent to reasonably play around what you're doing, especially if you've played them before. That is a thing that happens at the high end of the game. The typical thing to understand about this deck is that it's not just a Sandman deck. You can win on points just by playing Patriot, Blue Marvel, and Ultron and dropping 20 points into every other lane. That's a really powerful thing to do, as many decks are not particularly specialized for being able to deal with that. A curve of Dazzler, Patriot, Blue Marvel, Ultron will put about 20 points in most of the lanes that you have access to, and that is simply strong. You don't have to be a Sandman deck. It's helpful to be a Sandman deck. There's a lot of good things to be a Sandman deck against. But the downside of this strategy, of course, is that it's a little bit telegraphed. When your opponent is obviously able to see that you are playing something like Blue Marvel into Ultron, one of the things that you have a great weakness to is Alioth, because you will typically not be actually able to take priority. Alioth as well as Cosmo are fairly reasonable cards you can expect, which means that this deck goes from being a deck that can have a good matchup into OldRishem thanks to the things like Cassandra Nova and Absorbing Man, into one that is a little bit tougher if you're not on specifically Cassandra Absorbing Man as your plan in that matchup. OldRishem is a powerful deck still, and you do need to be prepared for it. Many people will ask if Cassandra Nova is replaceable in a deck like this, and the technical answer is, yeah, you can replace Cassandra Nova. However, you will end up being absolutely dead to everyone you queue into who plays OldRishem. You are a deck that is built to play one card per turn. OldRishem is a deck that is better at doing that than you are because they're an energy ahead on every single turn. You are not going to win a Sandman game against OldRishem, and when you are playing a non-Sandman game like the Ultron thing, you are vulnerable to cards like Alioth and Cosmo, which they are occasionally running. When you are doing Cassandra into Absorbing Man, at the very least, you can play a Sandman game because you will actually be able to be ahead of them. That is the fundamental premise of this deck. Play Sandman when you are ahead. When you are not, you are kind of an Ultron deck. That's how it goes. As weird as it may sound, I've actually had a little bit more personal success on Mickey's build of Sandman, which has a little bit of disruption in the form of Spider-Ham and Copycat, and unfortunately is just totally giving up on that OldRishem matchup. I mean, like, not totally, but like meaningfully. By not running Absorbing Man, you are taking a hit in that matchup. The issue is that this deck is, in my opinion, when you play it, it's going to be a lot better into basically everything else. You're going to be okay-ish into OldRishem. I would say it's probably unfavored, especially if you're not drawing Cassandra Nova. And even if you are, it's kind of hard to play a real game. But you do have some games where you can actually play against them thanks to Cassandra. And against every other deck in the game, I think this deck is a little bit more optimized to handle things. One note is that I don't think it's very good in the Sandman mirror, meaning that if you're seeing a lot of Patriot Sandman, this might not be the one to bring out. Also, a note on the Sandman mirror, if you are playing the Sandman mirror, you should never be playing Sandman. I did not feel like this was a note that was worth giving, but I still see people doing that. Sandman is not a card you play in the Sandman mirror. Sandman is a card that you play in every matchup where it would actually be relevant, but unless you don't have anything with more power than 7 on turn 5, you should be playing basically anything else when your opponent is also on Sandman. Now, the one thing that this deck does get is that I think it's a little bit less recognizable as a Sandman deck. Like, yeah, okay, once your Makari comes down, they can sort of figure out what's going on. but there's a lot of just sort of like generic good cards in here. You can play like Jeff into Cassandra into Captain Marvel, and they won't really have a good read on you being a Sandman deck, which means that like your Sandman plays can catch people off guard in more of a meaningful way. You are going to have to snap a couple of them, and that's a bit of a worry for me with this deck, is when you snap a Sandman, and you end up in a spot where, oh, wait, why are they snapping me here? They must be a Sandman deck. There is a little bit worry about telegraphing the fact that you're a Sandman deck, especially if your opponent is the kind of deck that really loses to Sandman, like a Bounce deck. You can end up in awkward situations. I know y'all didn't think you'd be able to get away from Thena for long. Despite the fact that I do think Sandman is pretty good into a deck like this, I think it becomes a little bit less good the more publicly known that it is. Both Sandman decks, I do think, are fairly reasonably good into this, and I think that is demonstrating a meaningful change in how this metagame is developing compared to last metagame. Last time, what happened was basically we had OldRishem, we realized the Thena decks were good into it, and then when the Thena decks ended up being good into OldRishem, we were like, okay, what beats the Thena decks? We went to Zoo. Now we're diverging a little bit. I think Sandman is something that meaningfully impacts the Thena decks. And one tip I have for playing against Sandman as Thena is to not play your Jeff. You're going to want your Jeff in hand against a Sandman deck. And I realize that's kind of a tall ask, because we just talked about how these decks are sort of able to disguise themselves as being non-Sandman decks. At me, I've started holding my Jeffs a lot, because Jeff can actually be played through Sandman on that final turn of the game, which is very valuable to you because A, your opponent might not necessarily be expecting it, and B, you have the ability to play multiple cards even when you are a Sandman, and that means that you can actually proc your Thena. So for that reason, a lot of the time, I'm just going to like defer to holding my Jeff, even if I would normally prefer to play it out, unless it's like literally the only play I can possibly make. And even in some of those cases, if I know the opponent is on Sandman, it is the kind of thing I might consider holding anyway. Now, you'll also notice that I have Cassandra Move-A in this deck. I don't necessarily think that's a stock decision. Many people are running something like Vision, for example, instead. I personally am of the opinion that you can't just fade the OldRishem matchup. While OldRishem is not everywhere the way it used to be, it's still around enough that I'm just very happy to run Cassandra Move-A. And the thing about Cassandra Move-A is people sort of look at it as this anti-OldRishem tech card. Oh, you're running this for OldRishem. But it's not like it's bad just curving it out. Curving it out is actually pretty good. One highlight I want to bring to a card that I think is a little bit underrated, and I think that is seeing a lot of play right now because it has been underrated for so long, is of course Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers, who has been an excellent card for just making sure that you are going to be in good situations consistently. Juggernaut has gotten a little bit worse as there have been more Brood decks, more Zoo decks, more decks that meaningfully can actually fill out the board, more Ultrons. Juggernaut's gotten worse, but Captain Marvel has gotten even better because you now no longer have to guess where those lanes are actually going to end up. You can just say, whatever happens, she will be able to win me the game. She's been very good for me. On the Juggernaut note, I don't have any better ideas, but he has been lacking in a world where Ultron is a very popular card. Now, let's say you looked at that last deck and you said, I don't really just want to devote Cassandra Move-A to beating OldRishem, I want to ruin it as much as possible. If you are someone who truly dislikes OldRishem and wants it to just go away, this is the deck for you. It's an alt of the previous Thena build that is giving up a little bit of general applicability in order to specifically focus on beating the crap out of OldRishem as much as you possibly can. And I have a lot of respect for people who are like, you know what? I'm sick of this. I'm going to free win every time I queue into this deck. And I do think that this is the closest you can get to a legitimate free win against OldRishem. I'm not sure if it's worth giving up the other tools that the Move deck has access to. I'm not sure if it's worth doing that. But I do have a ton of respect for anyone who is willing to say, you know what? If the metagame isn't going to police itself, I'm going to police the metagame. If you queue into me and you have 20 cards in your deck, I am going to play so many things with 20 power, and you are going to get run over. I will note that I think a lot of the reason that this kind of deck fell out of favor is because it's so much easier and probably a little bit better to just, there's a little bit less opportunity cost to just jam Cassandra Move-A in a deck, whereas the opportunity cost of fitting Darkhawk in a deck is actually pretty notable, because you'll notice we use a slot not just on Darkhawk, but we're also now a Mystique deck, which makes us an Iron Man deck, which makes us a Ravonna deck, which makes us, of course, we also, as a Darkhawk deck, have to be like a Rock Slide deck and a Korg deck. And so we end up really using like 5 slots on the Darkhawk package, maybe 6, depending on how you look at it. And that is like a huge opportunity cost compared to just slap Cassandra Nova in everything. Much lower opportunity cost, much less that you actually have to invest in having a reasonable OldRishem matchup. And so for that reason, I think like moves like this, taking a deck and going this direction and saying, I'm going to beat the crap out of OldRishem instead of just being like mildly favored into it, it ends up being a little bit of an overinvestment, but I do have a ton of respect for anyone who is willing to make that investment. Let's talk a little bit about OldRishem and the ways in which it has been evolving in recent days. This is the Fairishem list I posted a few days ago that I got from Derek, who was ranked 1 at the time. Shout out to Havoc OP. This is a powerful, reasonable list that I think is currently the most played Arishem list in top 10% Infinite. That might not be particularly meaningful further down the ladder. I think that this is what you should be expecting to see when people start playing Arishem, but there's a lot of variation in what the top end really starts to look like. One thing that I really want to highlight is Arishem's use of Shadow King, which I do think is very important right now because of how many decks are doing the EV calculation that we just talked about. It's much easier to splash Cassandra Nova in anything than it is to really hyper invest in being a Darkhawk deck. The interesting thing about this, however, is that Arishem is the kind of deck that if you get Loki'd off of it, is going to need to have no vulnerabilities to its own tech or minimal vulnerabilities to its own tech. That was the ethos behind why this deck was built the way that it was. There's no blob in here because we're a Shadow King deck. We don't want to get Loki'd and then get completely run over by our own cards. Speaking of Loki, that card is now the new sort of raison d'etre of the OldRishem deck existing at all. Being able to play Loki on turn 2 and then just play your opponent's deck but meaningfully better is kind of the thing that OldRishem does now. I think that's a really interesting departure. I know many people are going to look at this deck and say, wait, they buffed Loki in OldRishem, and I'm not sure that's actually true. Because when you look at OldRishem as a whole, it's less that they buffed Loki in OldRishem and more that Loki is now about the same amount of good as he was previously in the deck, but the other things that were really good in the deck are no longer there. A lot of the snap conditions with the old OldRishem deck were turn 4 Leech, turn 4 Darkhawk, having a Loki on turn 3. Those were the snap conditions that we had a lot of the time in the previous deck. Now we only really have one of those remaining. I don't necessarily think they buffed Loki in OldRishem, but I do think Loki gained an increased importance in the deck because it is now one of your few remaining guaranteed nut draw, oh my god, I'm going off easy snaps, as long as you have the slightest idea that what your opponent's deck is doing is something you can also do if you didn't draw an opening hand from that deck. It's a powerful, powerful card, and I do think that a lot of the time when someone is playing a 20-card deck and they snap you on turn 1, the thing that they're snapping is Loki. You should be aware of that. I may have jokingly called this one OldRishem, but honestly, I do think it's probably the better build of OldRishem right now. You'll notice that very little has changed, actually. We've got Copycat in here now. We've got Shadow King in here now, and we're just gonna, like, eat it, right? You'll notice the same kind of deck building is happening here, where you are a little bit worried about the Loki stuff, but the point that I was trying to make with the previous discussion of Loki is that on day 1 after the patch, there was so much Loki that we sort of had to deck build in such a way that that Fairishem build became the thing that made the most sense. I personally am seeing a little bit less Loki now, and that makes me think that a build like this is the one that makes the most sense in a vacuum, where we don't have to keep making the sacrifices of like, oh god, what if they Loki me? They'll blow up my blob. I'll get my own Shadow King. Like, yeah, okay, that'll happen, but it's not happening enough. On day 1, my day 1 top 8 decks list, there were 3 Loki decks. I don't think any of the experiments with other Loki builds other than OldRishem have really gone anywhere just yet, and that means that there's a little bit less. Remember, early metagames are a lot about experimentation, and experimentation also means that you have to read and react to what you're seeing. Since there's less Loki, in my humble opinion, you're going to want to end up playing an OldRishem deck that looks a little bit more like this. Alternates include maybe playing a Valentina instead of the Shadow King. I personally just don't like that. I think Shadow King's really important because basically every deck that is an OldRishem that I consider top tier is playing Cassandra Nova, and you do end up in trouble if you aren't able to meaningfully answer that card because Cassandra Nova beats the crap out of you. The other reason why, when we talk about Loki being a key card in this deck, is that turn 2 Loki makes their Cassandra Novas slightly smaller. And you might think that doesn't really matter, but it does. Taking like 8 power off of Cassandra Nova, that's an important thing to do. It really genuinely is. And I think that like the main thing about Loki in this current iteration of this archetype is that it is probably the strongest card in the deck by now without having any real meaningful competition. And that is, I don't know, I think a lot of people are going to be probably a little bit upset by that. Or I've seen a lot of sort of hyperbolically worded takes. I don't really see that as a good or a bad thing. I think it's probably just a thing. Loki's a good card in OldRishem. It already really was. So I don't really think much changed there, other than now you don't have a whole deck that is built around playing your deck but better. It's just a supplemental piece in OldRishem. That's probably a good thing, but I'm not really sure. I think people will take that for good or bad depending on who they are and what they actually think about the card Loki. It might seem weird for Zoo to be a deck that is popular to this level. I know that people are going to be a little bit confused and weirded out by that, because Zoo, I think of all of these decks, is the one that most people look at and they say, that's a deck for new players. What are we talking about here? Zoo's good. It's just a good deck. One of the major things that Zoo has going for it is that it is a deck that is able to do a lot of points across a lot of lanes while not being vulnerable to Juggernaut and while being a little bit taller than Thena decks. When this deck exists, it is very much in reaction to that kind of stuff. Downside, mild vulnerability to Sandman, and you have to figure out whether your opponent is playing Brood Abs in a Sandman shell or Brood Abs in a Killmonger shell, which is really hard to do. Like, there are multiple popular decks that have, like, good cards against this deck, and they look really similar before you see them. And so you have to make a pretty quick read on what's actually going to happen to you going into those final turns of the game. Mostly, I think that Zoo is a deck that will thrive when the cards that are good against it are not very popular. And, you know, it's gotten better in that respect. It used to be pretty bad into, like, getting Doc Ocked, for example. Doc Ock Magic stuff was fairly problematic for a deck like this in my experience. And now there's, like, some stuff that is problematic, but mostly less problematic than, like, old OldRishem with Doc Ock Magic Leech or whatever, right? And so you end up in a weird spot where I do think more decks are playing Killmonger right now. Surfer and Destroyer seeing meaningful play. You end up in an awkward spot there. If we were in the meta we were in before the patch, where it was just all Thena decks all the time, I would have a lot more faith in Zoo. But right now, I don't really think it has much of an ethos. I think it's a good deck, but things are moving against it in, frankly, a pretty unexpected way, thanks to the absorbing Manasance headlined by Silver Surfer and, of course, Sandman. Speaking of Silver Surfer, you may have seen the video I just did on this list. I think it's just genuinely very, very strong. It has, you know, upsides and downsides, but I think it sort of crystallizes to me that there are basically 2 or 3 types of good decks right now. There's OldRishem decks, there's Cassandra Nova decks, and then there's sort of decks that move in between those lines, right? And one of the things you might have noticed about the way this has sort of shaped up is that it's kind of free to run Cassandra Nova. It's just kind of a free thing. And like, you'll see like, oh, these aren't like necessarily Cassandra Nova decks. They're just decks that have Cassandra Nova so they don't get run over by OldRishem. Is that good design balance? I'm not really one to opine on that, but it does sort of strike me that that is very much what's actually happening. And I think the good thing about Cassandra Nova is it's not a dedicated tech card. Like, when people talk about this card like it's something you're only running for that matchup, it's not. It's just a good card that happens to beat the crap out of a good deck. And I think that is the part of it that I like. That part of this paradigm I consider actually good design. People aren't warping their decks tremendously. They're just running a good 3-drop, right? You're not going out of your way. You're just like playing a gladiator. And that's something most decks are interested in doing anyway, right? The odd thing to me is it makes me wonder how strong Fairishem would be if this card did not exist. And maybe we don't ever have to really figure that out, right? It's like trying to figure out how good Loki would have been without Mobius, but it is something that does come to mind. One of the things that I like about Cassandra is in that comparison to Mobius, where we have this look at a deck that would previously have run both of those cards. If Mobius was still relevant, it would be in this deck. But Mobius is a 3/3. That's it. Cassandra is actually widely applicable. So when people look at this, I wonder if they have it backwards. What I'm getting at is, why are we seeing so much Cassandra? It's because you can run her. It's not that you have to run Cassandra to beat OldRishem. It's just it's free to do. She's a good card anyway. This deck wants to have a 3-drop that curves into Absorbing Man well. When you don't have Brood, that's Cassandra, right? this deck would run Cassandra, OldRishem, or no. And I think there's a lot of decks that that's probably true of. And I think that is the part that I actually like about how Cassandra has entered this metagame. It's very easy to look at this video and leave a comment and say something like, why are all these decks playing Cassandra? Ugh, this metagame sucks. You can tell that it's OldRishem's fault. And I don't really think that's true. We're running Cassandra because Cassandra's good. And then also she happens to be amazing against OldRishem, but like mostly she's just good anyway. And I think this deck is a great example of that, and a great example of why Absorbing Man is something that we actually want. Silver Surfer has been hurting for Brood number 2 for a very long time. Now, don't get me wrong, Cassandra Nova is not as good as Brood when you are playing it into Absorbing Man. It's just not. But it is something to do with that curve. And previously, if you had an Absorbing Man and you didn't have a Brood, it was just sitting there doing nothing. Now you have Cassandra Nova, and you also have Gwenpool with it. Now, I really think Silver Surfer has a lot of room to thrive in a metagame like this, but you are going to want to keep an eye on the other pieces of the deck. We all know what a Silver Surfer deck looks like right now. We are very 100% aware of how this deck tends to look. I think that Silver Surfer's relevance to a metagame is dependent on a couple of factors. One, how good Killmonger is in a metagame. Right now, I'd say a little bit above average. And two, how good the non-Brood type slots at the 3-drop are good in a metagame. And right now with Cassandra Nova, they're pretty good. And so that is, I think, my case for why Silver Surfer makes legit sense in this metagame. Remember when on my top 8 decks, I had like this unfortunate premonition that we'd probably just end up going back to the old build of Ajax Bounce as opposed to playing the TLSG1 long term because I liked the TLSG1 so much and I wanted Doc Ock to be good. But it turns out, like, honestly, I can't get rid of Shang-Chi. I can't get rid of it. I'm sorry. And so this is the build of Bounce that I personally am into right now. Now, I will say, I don't think Bounce is in a particularly great spot. You have to be very, very, very heads up in order to beat the combination of Sandman and Killmonger that is running throughout the metagame right now. However, you are going to be meaningfully okay into decks like Zoo, into decks like Thena. You are going to be able to deal with Killmonger decks like Silver Surfer by making sure that you throw priority. You are going to be able to deal with decks like Sandman by making sure that you do everything on turn 5 and then your turn 6 is actually going to win the game. You can do that. You can do all of this stuff. A good player can take this deck and pilot it against any of the stuff we talked about and feel pretty good about it, honestly. The thing is, you have to always be right. And that is, I think, what would make anyone like want to second guess picking up this deck, is you are genuinely going to be taxed if you are not sure what you're playing against every single game you play. You have to be sure because there are so many different hammers and you can play around all of them, but you can also just get hammered. Took priority against the Surfer deck because you thought it was Sandman? Sorry, dude, you're getting Killmongered now. It's awkward, right? It's just an odd, awkward, weird position to be in, and I think that that is the ultimate failing of Bounce if I were to recommend it to other people. I love this deck, but it is very taxing if you aren't 100% sure of which thing your opponent is going to bring to bear against you, whether that be Shadow King and Shang-Chi, Killmonger, Sandman. There's stuff that these decks do that legitimately is good against you. Oh no, I got Eliath. Like, there's just things happen. And you have to be ready for all of those things at the same time. And because there are some decks that look really similar up until they don't, it's a little bit hard for me to recommend it, despite the fact that I think this deck is genuinely very powerful. I am overjoyed to report that I have been seeing more discard in the metagame right now, and that just makes me really happy. I'm a big fan of when discard is around and good and alive. I really do enjoy that. Of the 3 decks that we're going to talk about right now, Discard, Destroy, and Phoenix Force, just sort of like well-worn, powerful archetypes, I think Discard actually probably is the best one. Discard has this fundamental issue where it is a deck that is positioned so uniquely in the metagame, which is to say, Discard is a deck that is good against Shang-Chi decks when it can do more points than the Shang-Chi decks. However, it is less good than Shang-Chi decks into decks where that Shang-Chi is necessary, and it needs to be able to compensate for that with massive amounts of points. It is currently, I would say, not able to do that on a level where I would expect discard to be a permanent fixture on this tier list, but it is genuinely very close. Like, it is more close than it has been in a while, and I am a genuine fan of a deck that is positioned in this way. It's a powerful, meaningfully strong deck that has a lot of ability to do what you need to do in terms of putting points on the board and getting your opponent to leave games. Here's the thing. I don't think it's the best at doing that, and the fact that it can't run tech means it has awkward matchups compared to the Thena decks, which have maybe lower point output, but the ability to actually put Shang-Chi in the deck. And I do think that, it's hard, because you compare this deck, I think, by necessity, to a deck like Silver Surfer, to a deck like Thena, to a deck like Zoo, and all of those have more meaningfully applicable tech for this metagame than you do. Silver Surfer has Cassandra and Killmonger, Zoo gets to run Shadow King, Thena gets to run Cassandra and Shang-Chi, and you just have to sit there and do points at them. And that's not the worst thing in the world, but it is a meaningful limitation on the power of the deck. Destroy almost has sort of the opposite problem, where discard presents all of this stuff and says, it is impossible for you to actually deal with me in a meaningful way because there just really aren't a lot of red guardians in the metagame right now. I am the untechable power. You cannot Shang-Chi me. This deck ends up being just incredibly techable, right? Like, you can tech against Destroy very easily. And I don't even mean like running armor or whatever. I mean, Shang-Chi is really good against it. Cards like Enchantress can be good against it. Mobius is really good against it. Cassandra Nova is pretty good against it if it hits the right stuff. There's just a lot of stuff that's really good against this deck. The most common ones that you're going to see are Shang-Chi and Shadow King, and we're definitely in a bit of a Shadow King metagame, and that's a pretty awkward spot for a deck like this to be in. The interesting thing to me about Destroy is more that people keep playing it, despite the fact that the metagame seems to get continually more hostile to it. Like, this is a deck that has such clearly defined weaknesses, but again, it does have some clearly defined strengths as well. As a deck that naturally runs Killmonger, it ends up being pretty good into the decks that are vulnerable to that. And as a deck that has a tech slot, it does have more customizable ability than your other decks of this nature, like Discard. The tech slot here is being used on Arnim Zola. I think it's perfectly valid to run Shang-Chi instead, or to run, Lady Deathstrike or whatever you want in that spot. Feel free to experiment with Destroy. It's a well-worn archetype, and I think the fundamental issues with it will not be solved or anything by changing that one card, but you're also not going to hurt your deck all that much by having a surprise card. Let's talk a little bit about Phoenix Force, which is exactly the deck you remember it being. Phoenix Force is kind of always going to be here. It's the Sam Reich of Marvel Snap decks. It's been here the whole time. And I think that is almost, I would say, Phoenix Force might be the best deck to invest in because it's never going to be that bad. The only times Phoenix Force is that bad is when there's like another combo deck that is like meaningfully better at doing the thing that it does. And right now, I don't necessarily think that's true. I think Phoenix Force has just sort of consistently been like either the second best or best in the combo deck category. And that's kind of interesting to me. Like, this might have been the best investment you could possibly make as long as you were willing to only play one deck and only get cards that really go in that one deck. Phoenix Force Loki has sort of gone away because that was the kind of thing that was predicated on old Loki. We are back on the OldRishem, the Shimmy build. Why did I say OldRishem? Jesus. The Shuri Nimrod build, the Shimmy build, that's what that stands for, not OldRishem. You can tell how much OldRishem has rotted my brain just from the fact that I got as far as saying that as I did before I realized what was going on. So we're back on Shuri Nimrod. Shuri Nimrod, again, it's kind of a combo that's only really played here, but you are effectively a deck with two plans. You have the Phoenix Force plan, you have the Shuri Nimrod plan, and your job is to set up games where your opponent simply can't beat either of those things. That's what Phoenix Force does, and it has been doing it for a year now. A very, very powerful, very meaningfully strong deck. Honorable mention here goes to one of my friends, Gnome__plays, who has been playing a Black Knight War Machine build of the Thena list. And I think the impetus for this is basically War Machine is quite good into Sandman, and once you have War Machine, you start wanting to play, maybe a little bit of Infinite. And once you have the War Machine and the Infinite, you kind of want to be a Black Knight deck. I totally get it. I want to put this on the list, not just because it's been doing well for him in High Infinite. I believe he climbed into the top 50 with it, but it's an interesting concept that I think might get War Machine a second look. Genuinely, Sandman is one of the most popular decks at the higher levels of the game right now, and that is the kind of metagame that could call for War Machine. The thing that I think might end up being the downfall of War Machine is that it only really has one thing that comes along with it, and that is the Infinite. And I almost wonder if that's just like the kind of thing that, like, it's almost like a collar around War Machine's neck, where you want to be this certain kind of deck, but you find yourself unable to do it. This deck definitely, like most Black Knight decks, will have these games where you just have a hand that you cannot play. You'll have discard cards with no targets. You'll be sitting there with a Ghost Rider. You will have cards that you simply cannot play. You also have hands where you are doing things that are more unfair than anything else in the game. A Thena deck that is able to leverage extra energy in order to play Lady Sif Ghost Rider on the final turn of the game, bringing back an Infinite, is completely bonkers. You also have these games where you play, you know, a 20 power Ebony Blade and then a 23 power Ghost Rider on the final turn of the game because you got 2 extra energy from Hope Summers. That's also pretty bonkers. This is a deck that has a very high delta, a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. If you're interested, if you are steeled against the ravages of RNG, this could be the deck for you because there are things that this deck does that are pretty damn good. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. I really hope you enjoyed this look at the early metagame of post-patch Marvel Snap, and I hope that you are able to have the same success climbing as I have with these lists. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe. I will see you in the next one.